Wealth inequality grips our nation like many others with an iron fist. The land tax works to loosen that hold and more likely to lift our poor, hungry lower class out of poverty. Start with a little bit of setup. So, first point about how we reduce the harms of wealth inequality, and secondly, how increasing the government budget would benefit society as a whole. So, what does implementing the land value tax look like? Firstly, it looks like the form of legislation is passed. This means that it's been through rigorous checks and balances, so it's probably A, equitable, and B, rational. So this looks like considering cultural impacts and not applying this tax to parasites because A, they are protected by totality, and B, they are considered their own entity. This looks like a mountain who has gained personhood in this sense. Secondly, the government assesses the value without considering the buildings or possible development. So there's a pure natural land value as it holds at the time. 3, they enforce this land tax. This looks like X amount of dollars per hectare. And fourthly, the government is now using that revenue for social services and investment. We win this debate today if we prove the system is more equitable and obviously more efficient. So on my first point about how we reduce the harms of wealth inequality, note that it is the primary issue of wealth inequality is in passive land value. So why would this improve to a land value tax? One, at the very least, we take some sort of money off these people that are passively gaining wealth. This looks like being able to redistribute this money to lower income households. The government has an incentive in this sense to redistribute to lower middle income because they make up a large majority of the voter base compared to the rich minority that obviously makes up a small proportion of the voter base. And also they want to appear charitable because they are obviously wanting to get re-elected in this case. Secondly, it reduces the incentive to keep the land. Note that wealth inequality is cyclical like generational wealth. This looks like land being passed down through generations from their rich colonizers who came over and actually stole this land, and it gets passed down until they have a rich grandkid in the 21st century. This means they are more likely to actually sell this land because the investment value has decreased. So if you're a wealthy landowner and you're more likely to consider selling because you're obviously losing out a bit more because you have to pay this tax, and so more likely that we have land on the market. So why is this important? One, we reduce the wealth inequality. So the wealthy rich people, what the wealthy rich people lose is proportionally small to them, but is a significant impact on the lower class. So this looks like at least rich people keep this land, so suffer some cost, and the power of cyclical wealth is the power of cyclical wealth inequality is reduced, but at most we're actually actively reducing the wealth inequality by redistributing this land to increase affordable housing, or the government buys and uses for social services. So why is wealth inequality inequitably harmful? One, it is obviously unfair for the lower and middle class. I'll accept this POI this time.
What happens when a landowner is now being taxed annually and he increases the rent to the poor people living in his properties?
As we established before, we can actually provide subsidies for these people in these industries, but also for the lower class that actually are disproportionately affected by this land tax, as I'll discuss in my second point. So my second point about how the increase in government budget would actually benefit society. No, some businesses, like they said, and households are inequitably affected by the land tax. So the government wants to retain its efficiency in important industries and maintain equitable action. So how can this revenue gained fix this problem? One, they can subsidize industries affected by the land tax. This looks like farmers who rely on owning significant amounts of land for a business model. That is literally their job. They own land because they need to graze these farms and cows. However, the government could actually provide subsidization because it is in their interest. If the price of the land were to go up and they would have to pay more tax, it means that farmers would also have to increase the prices of their milk, which would inequitably affect the lower class who need that bread and milk to survive. So this is so the government, it would be in their best interest to actually subsidize these industries which disproportionately affect the poor. As I've already discussed, they are characterized, they want to get voted back in, they also want to be seen as charitable. So A, when industries are crucial, the government will provide significant subsidies in order to retain that. So this is when the costs outweigh the benefits, as I just said, with regards to disproportionately affecting the low class. This looks like getting the most of the money paid in tax given back in the form of a subsidy. So, and B, they wouldn't subsidize when an industry is unsuccessful. This looks like industries that aren't necessities and have negative externalities and wouldn't provide subsidies in this case. This looks like a country unlike NZ, where the dairy industry isn't crucial. They will weigh up the costs versus the benefits. If the costs of the greenhouse greenhouse gases that these farms and these industries emit outweighs the benefits of having this industry in this case, they were less likely to give the subsidy tax to that industry. Secondly, they consider funding. They can actually consider funding social services. This looks like they can mitigate any of the inequity caused by this land tax by investing in social services, such as more food banks, such as more education in no, thank you. Those that are proportionally affected by social services. This looks like the poor people in our society. They actually need these healthcare and education that would get more subsidies and get more investment from the government on our side of the debate, and they are less likely to actually, these people are less likely to afford these industries, and so are more likely to actually need these industries. Therefore, they are proportionally affected higher by the subsidies in this case, and also proportionally affected higher by the investment into these industries. Second, B, they reduce the lower tax brackets. So this looks like those renters that can't afford their rent. If we were to actually have this new level of income for the government, it would mean that we could actually reduce the tax that these lower class have to pay, and in the end, actually it benefits them in this case. So why is this important? One, we get more efficient accountability mechanisms in markets. If a market is failing and producers don't get the subsidies, they are incentivized to be better. This means that they are more likely to reduce the greenhouse gases that they produce, to remove the negative aspect that the government weighs in giving that subsidies. So they are more likely to try and actually have a positive environmental impact. And secondly, there's more capacity for social investment. I'll accept this POI at this time.
What incentive do you provide for people to develop their properties?
To develop their property? Well, obviously, if you are paying this tax at this time, I don't understand how that actually impacts the debate. Like, the tax isn't actually affecting the development of the properties, it's affecting the actual land itself. The land value grows and shrinks over time, whereas the land tax doesn't affect any of the development that you make on the property. So this is just like affecting those rich people who actually buy land and keep it and hold it to themselves so that they can actually artificially increase the value of land in that country, and so wait over time and obviously pass it down to generations. So by actually taxing these people, we get a new source of income, and actually we can help those poor people in those scenarios, and so I don't understand why you even introduced that POI. So secondly, we get more capacity for social investment. As I discussed before, we have better, the people that are disproportionately affected by this land tax actually have a better well-being, because more education, more healthcare, which they are disproportionately affected by, they get more of that because they actually need it. We see these lower and middle income households need healthcare and need education a bit more, and by actually giving that money towards those industries, they are proportionally benefited by that. And one, we further reduce inequality. We think that is obviously the principal idea of a government, to actually help all areas of the social classes, and obviously those who are suffering the most, which is the poor and lower middle income households, they are suffering the most in this case. So what is proportionally a small amount of money for a large income can actually feed those small income houses for a long period to come. We think that it is principally important in this debate, therefore you support our side of the debate, where we actually get better benefits for society as a whole, and obviously increase the image of the government. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now to open the case to negative, please welcome James.
When AF fails to see the tangible economic effects of this value tax, they stab the very vulnerable communities they claim to protect in the back. Four things I'll be doing for you in my speech today. First one on a little bit of setup, which I think we should, a little bit of setup, then onto some rebuttal, and then moving on to my two substantive points. One, on the negative effects that this is going to have on development, and therefore, like those flow-on effects from that. And then secondly, how we believe this is only going to create monopolies in the market, and those, again, flow-on effects from that. So first of all, some setup. Like, what do we actually think is going to happen immediately after this tax happens? Again, we kind of both sides agree that like this land is going to become far more expensive. We just think it's really important that we set up like really far more expensive in the short term for people to buy. They have to accommodate these running costs. Why do people buy and sell? First of all, we believe that people sell their land, they sell their property whenever it is no longer viable, whenever it is no longer profitable to keep the land they currently own for their livelihoods. Why do people buy? Because they even want to do it for investment or because they believe it is a necessity and they are able to do it. It's important context, and we'll get onto that why that's important later. So firstly, onto some rebuttal. We hear this general push from the AF side of the house that they're going to be able to get more money from these services and reallocate it into things like, first of all, subsidies to balance out any inequities, and then secondly, about social services. So first of all, about this idea of subsidies. First of all, we just think it's illogical to, first of all, okay, and we'll get onto it later a bit why more, that we believe rents are going to be increased. But in order, if you're taking tax money and then you're just giving these subsidies back to the people to then pay the tax again, that is illogical. That is steps being taken where we don't need to. There's actually a cost to that. There's bureaucracy that is going to happen. We believe people are going to like lose faith in government. We just believe that's an illogical thing to keep on doing. So we just don't believe that's like a reasonable thing to be doing, especially like when in the time you're waiting because government is like generally slow. We also get this idea that like all this money is going to be reallocated to social services. And we get this idea that the reason because of this is because of political incentives. We just don't believe that's true. The National Party does not have the same political incentives, such as Labour. They value different things, they have different voter bases. We still believe they can get voted in on different things, not just because like the general population as a whole. So that is why we just don't believe that all this money is going to be reallocated, as they say, into social services. So onto my first substantive point. So first of all, what are the effects on development and why do we think this is important? So again, context for this is development requires a lot of money to implement. And we talk about development, we're talking about like things like investing in infrastructure, investment in like hospitals, houses, things such as that. We're going to prove to you in this point that we get less development, which impacts which has social impacts and also has economic impacts. So how do we prove this? First of all, we just generally believe that people have less money to spend. You have the money, now we have to spend more money paying on this value tax, this land tax, which means we've got less money that you can be spending on development. Less disposable money to be spending on development. And then we just believe, first of all, people are going to be far more careful. They're going to take less risk in order when it comes to taking development because they've got less money to do it with. What does this mean? When you're spending less money on development, you're building less things such as roads, such as transports, such as houses, such as healthcare. We just think when you have less money, that's just not things you're going to be prioritizing. So what do we believe what are the outcomes of this? We believe that ultimately, like things like transport's harder to get around. We believe like the worst standard of living for people as a whole, for the people of New Zealand, we believe often it can be like private companies that are doing this. They're not going to be able to do this now because they have less money to be spending on development. Secondly, we believe that like when you have worse land, we're going to get more development on that land. Why do we believe this? Because when it's more expensive to hold land, it means far less people are going to be able to buy that high quality, high value land, that good land, right? It means that only the top percentage is going to be able to like ride out that cost and still be able to buy that land. The top percentage is like the upper to middle class is going to be able to buy that land. It means the richest people can stomach that cost. It means the poorest people cannot. If they want to buy land, if they want to buy houses, they have to do it in worse land. What do we think that worse land is going to look like? It's going to look like when you're like earthquake risk really heavily prone. You're like right next to a cliff in Wellington. You're right next to a landslide. Is liquefaction, for example. These are bad places to be building. These are unsafe places to be building. What they're doing is they're literally making, what the Act proposes is to make sure that more poor people are going to be ending up living on this land, which they're unable to do because they cannot access that better land. Because again, we just don't believe they have that money to do that. Now it's become more expensive. When we have more poor people living on worse land, we believe that ultimately, when we have like more people living in these dangerous areas, this is putting their safety at risk, the most vulnerable people at risk. There's like higher chances of sickness and harm to them, which they aren't able to pay, they aren't able to do with because they've got less money they can spend on things such as healthcare, for example. We believe this is ultimately a negative impact on particularly poor people and the vulnerable people as a whole. Yeah, I'll take a peek.
We established how the tax doesn't affect quality, but more likely quantity with regards to X number per hectares. How does this affect your entire argument about like the quality of the land?
Well, we just firstly believe when you're talking about the land value is determined by how good the land is. If you're in a good location, you're going to get better land, right? But also land that is at risk, land that is generally at risk is just going to be worse value, right? So we just don't believe that's true, and just we believe that that's not a rational way to be operating. Third way we prove this is that fundamentally, when you're rushing, we believe that you're going to be rushing more development from these companies. If we circle back to the companies, imagine you are a company, you're a company, you want to build a farming land somewhere, okay? The more time you hold on to land without building something on it, without making a profit off it, is more time you're running at a loss because of this tax. You're losing far more money. You can offset this by making more profit, by building faster, by getting more money from this. For example, building a factory, for example. So what are you incentivized to do? You're incentivized to build and increase your development as fast as possible, right? Because you want to stop as fast as possible from losing as much money as you can. What does this mean you're going to do? It means you're going to do things like cutting corners. It means you're going to push permits really, really fast. You're going to try, get around the system and find loopholes. What does this mean? We believe there's going to be something dangerous to do. The permits, the loopholes are there for a reason. Not the loopholes, but the regulations are there for a reason. If you're trying to get around them because you're trying to build faster, that's going to be dangerous for you. We also believe if you're working workers harder in order to get there, there's going to be harm for them, but also environmental damage if you're taking less care for the environment when you're building it. Why you have less care for the environment? Because ultimately, we just believe that you're trying to work faster. And so ultimately, we believe after all of that, we've got more vulnerable people at risk, but also the general standard of living is going to decrease. So why do we believe we're also going to be getting more, and what are the effects of monopolies? Again, if land is more expensive now, we're going to be able to prove to you in this point that AF is actually creating monopolies, which are going to have these serious harms. So firstly, we prove this by making these generally things, such as farming, for example, less viable. We believe that farmers at the moment are currently really biting the bullet as it is, right? After Cyclone Gabrielle, etc. It's far more expensive now, and it's far more expensive now to own this land, as if we take their definition, a lot of land which farmers have. It's far less viable to have that if these farmers own tons of land. We believe that what does it push them to do? It pushes them either to run out of business, to become bankrupt, because they have to spend so much money on this. We also believe you're either pushed to sell or at the very least reduce your quantity. So either they run out of business, and so who really comes in? These larger companies are going to come in. What is larger companies moving in en masse buying who can ride these costs out? It means that monopolies are going to be created. So we believe that generally farmers are going to be worse off. We also believe that monopolies, duopolies, means it's going to be far less competitive. They're not going to be driving the price down as much, and the prices are going to increase for the general population. Secondly, we believe it's going to cost the consumer. Why do we believe this? If landlords have more taxes, far more expensive, they're going to be incentivized to pass that on to the consumer. We also believe in the current housing market, you can't go elsewhere. So you're just going to want you pass that on to the consumers, and renters have to deal with that. That is far more for the most vulnerable people. Again, we find that they have to pay more because of this. These are the tangible outcomes for the most vulnerable people that lose out under this. Those are who we should be caring about in this debate, and that is why I'm proud to negate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now to continue the case for the affirmative, please welcome Marty.
I don't think there's a world in which a partial land value tax sends producers into a spiral where they start suddenly destroying the environment and actively working their employees like slaves. There are regulations in place. We need to be reasonable and charitable in this debate. So firstly, a quick point of clarity, and then onto the people in need, then producers, and then substantive contribution about landlord exploitation and income inequality. So firstly, on clarity. Look, we hear this big push that there's this huge extreme cost of a land value tax, and that only the rich are going to be able to cop that cost. Look, for a couple of responses here. Firstly, reasonably, we don't think that the poor or middle class are buying large quantities of land on either side of the house. It's just irrational to believe that in a cost of living crisis, they're buying like 10-acre like groups of land as like a poor or low income family. But secondly, I don't think that the cost of this is very high. Like it's like just an X amount per hectare. Like given that they're not buying that large quantity of land, it's far more likely that the rich are disproportionately affected. If anyone's copying any cost, it is those upper class people who they say won't be affected. So then moving on to the people in need. We heard like in response to our material about subsidies that it's like a highly inefficient system to get paid back. A few responses here. Firstly, we think that a bit of inefficiency should be weighed over the inequality and future harm of wealth inequality that like will come as a result of like not having this land value tax. For example, like just because you maybe have to wait a month before you get paid back because like you've had to pay this tax on your house, that I think that's far more beneficial than on the affirming side of the house, where in like 10 years time you like aren't really that like proportionately wealthy because like the value of like some rich guy from America's land has gone up so much that he's like now just thriving. But secondly, once again, I think that like having direct subsidies in the forms of like tax relief are generally quite efficient. We told you about like politicians' incentives and why they're likely to do that quickly. So then that kind of leads me on perfectly to how like they won't reallocate this money to social services because they just don't care, or like they'll still get voted in anyways. Firstly, I just think this is quite irrational because everyone uses social services. Note that like even the upper class and like the upper middle class still rely on like healthcare and like send their kids to public schools. They still need this. Secondly, I think the importance of this has been hugely evidenced in like Luxon getting in on like his tax relief scheme. Like I think it is rational to believe that like every party, no matter what their priorities are, understands the importance of social services. But thirdly, I think that like the reality is that the lower and middle class who do especially want these social services make up the most significant quantity of the voter base. Therefore, they have the most important weighting to try and tip in your favor. So at the end of that, I think our material on subsidies still stands and should be weighed the most highly in this debate. Note that there's a marginal cost under our model to the upper class when they have like this land value tax, but we think that the importance of reinvesting that money is significant for like a lower class family. Something that might have only been like a little chip off your shoulder for like a rich, wealthy family is like food on the table. That's like more education and health services. That's huge and should be debate winning. So then on to producers. We heard that like they're going to offset this cost by increasing production. So firstly, let's like identify what this cost does look like to producers. It looks like another cost of production, just like anything, just like the taxes they get on the imports that they like take in, the cost of materials. When there is an increase on like a tax of production or like an increase in like a labor law on how much they have to pay their workers, they don't suddenly go into this frenzy of like, oh, let's expand and like start killing all of the fish in the water because we want to like make a lot of money. That's not the reality of what this cost looks like to producers. But secondly, there are other barriers that exist to prevent this like wild goose chase of production, because like the harms that were characterized by AF were significant. They're saying that like they're just going to significantly increase their greenhouse gas emissions and like overwork their employees to the point of like slavery. I think that there are labor laws that exist in most countries that are employing this land value tax, and I think that there are like greenhouse gas cap emissions. So then on this idea of like monopolies, two notes before I start my responses here. Firstly, the government has an incentive to protect valuable industries. And secondly, this applies specifically because they used dairy as their example. I think in countries like New Zealand, where dairy is so important and they like value the producers, it's far more likely that they subsidize and try to keep those afloat. I don't see like a dairy monopoly incurring when you like fund those people. This means that we think that monopolies are far more likely to occur on their side of the house, where the the rich get richer because like the value of their land just continues to increase with no like proportionate response. This means that like for someone in a lower income area, like who is like working on a farm, someone who owns like a significant proportion more and maybe like violates a few more greenhouse gas laws, who isn't like getting penalized, like so like they commit maybe more greenhouse gas emissions, they don't get penalized for that, like they're more efficient that way, so they like outcompete these smaller producers. There's far more likely to see monopolies occurring in that way when we don't have any way to have accountability or like give these people any incentive to like acknowledge rules. Yeah, I'll take it for a while.
How do you manage to get the money to increase social services across the board, cover subsidies for farmers and renters if the tax increase isn't substantial?
I think it is substantial in the point that like it will affect people who own like several like expensive like properties. It isn't significant in the fact that like it's gonna appear to be a big cost to those people because they are so large. That was just like the characterization of what it looks like to them. I don't think like that really applies here. But either way, I also don't think that the cost is necessarily that vast because it wouldn't be that many industries that are actively affected that much. So then onto like this idea of landlords exploitation, and like this is my substantive material. So basically we had a push that like they pass on the cost to their people. Firstly, there isn't really a cost. Like, what kind of property are these landlords owning? A, apartment buildings, or B, suburban homes? Note that A, although these might have a great value as a whole, the actual land is not that large, therefore it's unlikely expensive. And even if it does have a greater value due to like location or something, like I think like 300 square meters like isn't that big. B, in cases where landlord properties like do have a high value, or like it's a nice property, I think it's likely that like richer people are renting that property, and therefore they're more likely to be able to cop any costs that do get passed down. So either there isn't a cost or it's not really significant to the renters, therefore they can't really have their impacts. We think that the debate is really about like these wealthy landowners and preventing wealth inequality. We think what it is about is helping like local economies to become more efficient and like more equitable. So secondly, even if like cost issues do exist, the revenue that can fix this like inequity. This looks like either direct support, like increasing benefits, reducing tax brackets, or like providing tax relief, which means that like families get a direct monetary ability to like put more food on the table, or like maybe drive their car to work instead of like taking the bus, or they like invest in social services like healthcare, education, and food banks. We think this goes a long way for these people who have impacted. Like at our best, there's still a net positive even if there is a cost suffered in rent, because like the capacity for someone who is poor to use free healthcare is far more significant than a slight increase in their rent. Thirdly, at least we prevent like overpowerful landlords. This means that people with heaps of properties like maybe get rid of a couple, or like it prevents them from trying to expand at the minimum. This means we prevent income inequality like in the future. We think that all of this future harm of like wealth inequality and income inequality can outweigh any minor benefit, but we think we fix any like benefit and claim all the impacts to like people in poverty when we tell you that we provide subsidies and help local economies.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. Now to continue the case for the negative.
I heard a lovely word in the speech of the first affirmative speaker. He said charitable. I remember them talking about what a charitable case is. I would say what is uncharitable about a case is when you say we will take literally everyone's money and then we will solve all of the world's problems just because we have all this money. This is not a model that works in practicality. This is not a model that works in sense, just taking money and then giving it back. This is not a model I think it is charitable to run, and this is not a model that they can win today's debate on. Let me tell you why. Okay, 3 main reasons. First of all, we're talking about wealth inequality. Second of all, we're talking about development. And third of all, we're talking about a smaller point about monopolies. Okay, so they're giving you a massive push about how they're solving wealth inequality. They've told you that now rich people are going to be forced to sell land. But okay, the people who buy that land then, the poorer people, then the rich people obviously, are then going to have this cost passed on to them. This cost is going to affect the rich people for like a year until they sell the land, and it's going to affect these people for the rest of their lives. How is that affecting the rich? I don't see it. Then they sell that we're going to give back to... They tell us their entire model of giving money back to people we just took it from. 1, obviously, this is a ridiculous model, but 2, let's have a look at some ways where it's actually going to cause issues. First of all, bureaucracy obviously costs a lot of money. Simply cycling this money through a massive government system is inefficient because we need to have land valuers out land all the time. We need to have people deciding who gets what in terms of subsidies. We need to have constant political debates about where this money needs to be going. And most importantly, we are shackling a previously free, independent and successful industry like our dairy industry to government support. They will be unable to function without government support because they are being taxed again and again and again. So what happens when they lose that government support? The industry goes under. Either we shackle our government to allocating massive portions of the budget to them all the time, which is not always politically viable, because while people might care about some sort of social services like money for an upper tax bracket or a lower tax bracket or whatever, they still are not always going to be focused on giving money to this particular group. That is going to become a contentious political issue, because now this money has been taken away from them and put into the world of politics where it doesn't belong and where it will be allocated to other people, because in politics, budget cuts get made. I think we're all aware of that. Okay. Then they told us that the rich are going to be disproportionately affected by this. I'll tell you who's going to be disproportionately affected by this. The people who don't have the money to ride out the storm of the cost. Even if we use their model of giving all this money to farmers, right? Then we say, okay, so we take all this money away, we process it, and in the meantime, the farmers are missing a massive chunk of money that they previously used to keep their business going. That means they're going to have to sell off land, creating monopolies. That means they're going under. That means their industry is failing. This is something they have to stand for on their side of the house. They also tell us that, like, social services as well. Not only is this like yet another thing they're putting their money in, so far they've put into social services, subsidies, and cuts, right? They need a lot of money to do something like that. No. But also, I think we heard it in your speech, but also, they are not going to be able to sustain these better social services to help, like, the disproportionately affected groups. Why? Because once again, this is a political issue. Two, these people are now going to need more and more money because of the reasons we're describing to you about development, about increased housing prices, about landlords, etc. So it is simply, again, shackling them to government support. We can't bring everyone into a system of government support when they were previously working fine on their own, just to disproportionately affect a group that can ride out the storm. But hey, if they want to talk about things government can do that have nothing to do with this debate, like social services, let's talk about other solutions to wealth inequality. Let's talk about inheritance tax so that this land can't be passed down and passed down and passed down. Let's talk about higher tax brackets, right? More tax on the rich. There are many ways to fix their problem that isn't just going to affect the most vulnerable people in the country, the poor people who own land, and the farmers who are barely scraping by. There are a million solutions, but they refuse to see them because they are only focused in on this one narrow approach. Okay. Oh, and finally, this idea of the valuation of land. They tell you that it's only valued by the amount of land. Okay. Farmers own a lot more land than even rich people. Rich people's property is usually tied up in like 1 square hectare of land that's in a really nice beach and a really nice property, so that's where they're getting their money from, right? So this is obviously going to disproportionately affect the people who own large amounts of land for their commercial business rather than the farmers, rather than the rich people. So this whole idea of land valuation is simply irrelevant. Now let's talk about development. Now we've explained to you a very simple mechanism for how we get less development. Development takes time. Transmission Gully was thought of in 1940 and finished in 2018. Okay, that is a massive gap when they were working on this project. That is something all developers know. That is an inherent risk of development. What happens when we increase the land tax? We increase that risk by a bunch of times because now it takes a lot longer to get anything done, and there's this huge looming land tax that must be large if they want to claim any of their benefits hanging over the heads of developers. This means they're less likely to buy land to invest in, right? This means they're less likely to take that risk because the risk is so much higher. That means we are getting less development. That means we're getting less houses, which means we're increasing the adverse effects of the housing crisis, which adversely affects, let me think, the disproportionately affected lower classes, right? Also, we are getting less things being built. We are getting less things that the public has access to. This is fundamentally a huge problem. And we are getting less money coming into New Zealand and being invested, which is terrible for our economy because we are scaring everyone off because we have this massive land tax that nobody else is doing, maybe because it's a terrible idea.
Why?
Yeah, I'm nearly at the end of this, so...
It does not say that the land tax will be implemented in New Zealand. It said the land tax will be implemented. Does this not affect other countries?
We'll do it everywhere then. We still have all the bad effects I'm telling you about, except now developers are going to go to the poorest countries that have to keep the lowest land tax because of the pressure on them. That means the development is now going on in, Haiti rather than in New Zealand. Not only is that bad for the New Zealand economy, it's not very good for this development. It's not very good for the people in these areas because they are going to be exploited because they are the weaker countries. There is simply nothing good about bouncing around around the world until you find the most exploitative place because there is a massive land tax hanging over the head of development. We want people to develop. We want to fix the problems that are facing us. Finally, we get to this idea of monopolies. Now, they don't really respond to monopolies strongly except to say that, like, okay, well, landlords don't usually own that much land, which is kind of what I'm saying about rich people. But anyway, one, obviously we have landlords who own large buildings, which is going to be an increased cost, so that is always getting passed on to the consumer. I don't care if it's not incredibly massive, it is still large, and that is going to have a lot of effect on the people who are living in poor conditions, and the people who don't have the money to make it week to week, on the people where a $1 or $5 or $10 increase is the end of their housing, right? But also there's ideas like people lease lots of farmland and development land so that it can be developed. There's a lot of systems going on where land gets rented out. This is simply going to have much higher costs on our side of the house, which isn't going to only affect farmers and developers who are leasing this land. That's what we care about, right? Successful industry and successful development. But also it is simply going to affect everyone who is living in a landlord type place. So at the end of this point, we see that their wealth inequality point is not only based on a mechanism of fixing all the world's problems because we have an ambiguously larger amount of money, but it is also wrong because they are disproportionately affecting the lower classes, because they are building up a system that perpetuates inequality, and because they are slamming massive costs on the lower classes. That's it. They're giving people massive costs. They can't justify their way out of that, all right? So that is why we win this debate, because they are setting up monopolies, because they are stifling development, and because they are ruining wealth equality.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now to get to the final substantive speech for the affirmative team, we welcome Carl.
The negating side has made our side out to be like we're just trying to really harm the rich, and then there might be some like possible benefits to the poor, but like at least we take away heaps of money from the rich. Our goal is not to like make all these rich people suddenly become middle class, because the true goal is to help lower class people be able to afford the basic things like healthcare, education, etc. that really are the things that like truly impact their life. We don't need all rich people to suddenly not be able to afford to like own lots of land. We need these poor people to be able to afford any of the necessities that like these rich people can like unequitably afford. I'm going to go through 2 points of clash, development and like businesses, etc., and then people in need. My first point in development is that they talked about how because there's like less money having to pay this like land tax, they'll be like building less roads and like less hospitals, etc., because there's like less money. I think for one, obviously we're not going to be taxing government-owned land, such as where you're building roads, because that would just be redundant because it's the tax, it's going to the government. And then they did mention something about like private hospitals, and I think even if you believe that there's a large enough amount of like private like hospitals, etc., that it's going to be like proportionally affected. Well, obviously private hospitals are expensive. Only wealthy people go there. Therefore, the owners of private hospitals have a lot of money, and I think it's really unlikely that they are going to be sort of affected so much they're going to stop building any kind of like private healthcare system because of this one tax. I think that's completely unrealistic. But even if you do believe that they're suddenly going to stop, I think it's pretty easy to weigh up that it's far better if majority of people that are in the public healthcare system can afford healthcare, which we can like make more accessible through the money received in these taxes, which I'll go into more throughout my speech, than if like a few rich people have a slightly less developed private hospital. Because at the end of the day, like we support the majority, and the majority is not in the private
Point of information?
private healthcare system. So I feel like we can accept the harms of rich people having a worse private healthcare system if through that we get better public healthcare system for the majority. I'll take your point.
Does the speaker not recognise that development can also include things like building houses to fix the housing crisis?
I think I'll go into that more in a bit, but I think a lot of governments are now receiving more money from this. They're not characterizing the fact that this money isn't going nowhere. The government is still going to have this money to put into things like housing. The money isn't just coming from the poor people, and then all these poor people are going to have suddenly no money, and there's no houses because the builders don't have money either. The money is predominantly going to be coming from the rich people, obviously, because the rich people own the most land, and that's how tax works. So obviously, the rich people are going to be getting taxed the most, and the highest percentage of money is coming from rich people, and therefore, when you put it back in the system, it's going to proportionately benefit the lower class more. They talked about how farming industries are going to go bankrupt and they won't have enough money. We already talked about subsidies, which I think they sort of failed to properly reply to, except that it'll take too long and it's too expensive to put the money back. I think one, this is unrealistic because subsidies exist in the status quo. They already have those systems in place where they're putting money back in. So I feel like that's pretty just that kind of falls out of the debate, because farming industries are not going to go under in this way because they're getting the subsidies from the tax. They talk about how, because if they have empty land and they want to develop, but now they're paying money, so they're at a loss, they're going to be cutting corners. I think Ollie replied to this pretty sufficiently, but I'll go into it a bit more. Rich people have an incentive to make more money. That's pretty much the incentive majority of people in the business world. I don't know how much you can characterize that rich people buy all this land with plans to build developments on it, but then just leave it for a bit. I don't know how. I feel that's not too realistic. So they have an incentive to make money, and obviously they're going to make more money in the long term if they get on with it quickly, no matter if they're paying a tax or not paying a tax. And even if you don't believe this time, just maybe if they're losing money in that short term, I don't think that's going to be such a big negative impact to them. That's something they're going to be cutting all these corners and cause a crash of environmental effects. I feel that's completely unrealistic, because once again, these rich people are very wealthy. They have the money to be able to afford to do these things, and that's our point. We're not undercutting all the rich people, making them all go bankrupt, because they have the money to afford this. We're supporting a decrease of disproportionate wealth by supporting lower income people. I'll take a point. Okay, moving on to lower income people. They talked quickly on just politicians aren't necessarily incentivized to put all the money back in. I think this is completely unrealistic, because no matter which political party you want, the large majority is not the wealthy people owning heaps of land and capitalizing on renting out. That's just not true. That's the majority of people. Majority of people just own their house or whatever, and that's the land they own, that's what they'd be paying tax on, getting taxed on. And therefore, I think it's pretty fair to say that the government does have an incentive to put more money into education, to put more money in healthcare. I think saying that because there's differing opinions, they won't want that is completely unrealistic. On to how it's affecting this, the main point, how it's affecting lower income families worse because they have that cost on their land. I think that they talked about how even if there's a $10 increase, that could be detrimental to them, and then their whole life could fall over because they can't afford that $10 increase. I think maybe there will be a $10 increase, and yes, that could be detrimental to them, but the effects of that are overridden by then the money that we put back into education, healthcare, which at the end of the day are the things that these people care about. Yes, maybe their rent will go up a little higher because their landlord now has to account for these extra taxes, but it means maybe their school uniforms are a bit cheaper, maybe their groceries are a bit cheaper, and these are the costs that really add up at the end of the day, because these costs aren't going to be equal. It's not they're going to live the same life they had before, because they have more money. The government has more money than what the lower income people are losing, as I already went over in my first point. The government is taking more money from the rich people than it's taking from the poor people, because obviously lower income people that have one section of land with their houses are not going to be paying near as much money as the people that have 7 massive apartment complexes. Obviously they're going to be putting far much more money in, and therefore lower income families are able to receive so much more than they are having to put into the system. I'll take a POI if you have one.
Does the speaker not recognise the already existence of concepts like property tax that take the money from these rich developed properties and give it to the poor people already?
Well, I think, like, I don't fully understand that, if I'm being honest, but at the end of the day, this is just another tax taking more money from the rich. Surely we're just, like, no matter if it's still in place, surely it's better if we're getting more of it, like, because obviously there's still lower class people that are really struggling, so surely it's going to be, and like education systems failing, so they can't pay teachers enough, so surely it's going to be better if you can just get more money, even if there are already systems in place like that. At the end of the day, by like getting, it's, the negating team has failed to like characterize at all how by taking money from these rich people that are just passively owning land from generational wealth where it's like really unequitable, and by putting that money back into systems where we can build more government housing, we can like provide better education, we can provide better healthcare to the majority. They failed to like characterize how that's not going to be helping the lower class. They've relied so much on like, oh, well, you can't develop. All of their development material is mainly going to be impacting the upper class, the people that already have access to private healthcare, private education. The real people that are like affected and harmed in this debate are the lower class, and those impacts are the ones that should be weighed most highly.
Sweet. I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now to the final substantive speech of the debate, please welcome Lydia.
My coaches can confirm that I'm no expert on economy, but I think that AF has got so bogged down in the principle of their case, which I relate to, that they fail to see the real impacts of the land value tax on our economy and by effect on all of our people, especially the vulnerable ones. A few things to get through in this debate. Firstly, some clarity on like what this cost of land value tax actually looks like, and engaging with some of the stuff that Ollie gave us at second. And then this idea of wealth inequality that they've given us versus our monopolies point, which falls under who has better outcomes for wealth inequality and what does this mean for vulnerable people, and then who like gets more overall benefits to society, and that's where I'll address all of their stuff on social services, subsidies, and producers. Okay, so firstly, some clarity on this cost of land value tax, and to be honest, I don't understand what they're saying at all, because they claim that like no one's really going to be hurt by this tax. It's actually not going to be so detrimental. And yet they're going to be able to get so much money from it that they can basically just like solve the humongous gap inequality. They can fix all poverty. They can give everyone subsidies, including farmers, including people who like can't afford rent, including people who can't afford groceries. We think that this is just like not feasible, and we think that they've tried to overshoot. They mean well, but it's simply not a possible case. And like they've tried to say that we're basically on the rich people's side, where we don't think that like rich people are super affected by this. We think that they are, but this affects negatively vulnerable people. What do I mean by this? I think that rich people, as they've characterized for me, cling to their money. I think they are the most stingy people that I've ever met, and I go to Scots College. And so what do I mean by this? I mean that when you tell them we are going to take some level of their money away from them and then redistribute it to a bunch of poor people who like essentially pay them, because that's how like landlords and rent works, we think that they're going to be like pretty unhappy with this. We think that we can reasonably say that they don't want to have to pay this tax, that as a result they're going to increase their rent, they're going to force people out because there are others who can come in and like pay a higher rent. What does this mean? This means that the vulnerable people that we both care so much about are forced out of homes, live on the streets, and like end up having to rely on the subsidies now, which like on our side of the house we don't need because they have homes, that kind of thing. So this is why we like simply cannot agree with their case. And then like So moving on to this wealth inequality point, which I think that I've gotten a little bit into. Firstly, this point on like rich people owning land and then having to sell land because it costs more and then like somehow giving it to poor people. I don't really understand the mechanisms behind that. Maybe I just need to take economy. But I think that it's fair to say that poor people can't afford to like buy all these properties even if the prices of them go down because of the long-term effect of this tax, because it's actually going to cost them more money in the long run. I think that like on our monopolies point, they've said that like governments have incentives to value farmers, to subsidize them, etc. Okay, so firstly, I think this is just a weird thing to do, to tell farmers that you own X amount of land, therefore you need to give us money so we can look after our vulnerable people, and then going, oh, actually our vulnerable people is you, whoopsies, here's your money back. We think that we've like just bogged that down in a lot of bureaucracy that we don't really need, and that is like completely unnecessary. We think that if we care so much about our farmers, we'll make it easier for them to own land, we'll make it cheaper for them to own land, instead of like taxing them and then giving them their money back. This just doesn't make sense to me. I think that even if you buy what Ollie has tried to tell you about how like it's okay to be inefficient if we're like benefiting the wealth equality, I think that like you simply can't, because we don't buy these benefits to the gap in wealth inequality. I think even if we are somehow able to make some like small marginal difference, it actually doesn't matter, because we get like all this bureaucratic processing, we all get all this like uprise from the people with wealth and money and power who are actually able to affect change. Even if we want to help poor people in this way, we don't think that it's feasible because of this. Okay, so like moving on to this landlord's point, I think I went over it a little bit, but they've told us that, like, at the very least, and they said this to Ollie, that they're preventing overpowerful landlords because they have to sell their properties. Okay, a few things. I think that I've mechanized already why it's more likely that they'll increase rent, because the more they increase rent, they can basically just get it to like the ceiling price that someone is willing to pay, and then when they surpass that, like they just pick a family, and then everyone else, like that's like one family out of 5 who ends up with a house, and then the other 4 are left out on the streets. No, thank you. We think that like even if you don't buy that, we've mech'd out pretty well for you at James why when they sell their properties, these properties are going to go to large monopolies who can afford to develop this property. What do I mean by this? I mean that like when we know, thanks to Michael, that development of properties takes time, when we know that this time like necessarily comes with like a tax, it is only these large monopolies and companies that can afford this tax annually that are then going to be able to afford to buy this property and develop it properly. We don't think that anybody else has the option. Yes, Ollie?
Alright, so you say that like these landlords pass on a significant cost, but like if they own like one plot of land, that's probably $200 a year, because it's like 0.0001% of their land value, right? And it's like 300 square
Yeah,
meters.
but then I think they still have the excuse to say that, oh, we've got some level of tax and so we're going to raise our prices, and we think that it's really hard for people to combat that when this is literally the difference between you living in a house and you living on the street. We think that the landlords are the people that hold power here, and that is why this is so important as a point in this debate. We think that they like underestimate the impact of a landlord's influence on a vulnerable person's life, because they are the people that wield power, they are the people that wield money. They've characterized this for us. No, thank you, Jacob. Okay, so benefits to society overall. Who gets more? Look, this is hard for me because I don't understand economics. But they told us about like market failing and how when the market fails, somehow people will be better and we're going to have less greenhouse gas emissions. Guys, what the heck does that even mean? I think that when the market fails, people get even more desperate. I think that it looks like people cutting corners. It looks like people having no time to care about like the greenhouse gas emissions that they're making, and only time to care about how they're like actually going to make money. We think that especially when people see the need to develop quickly because they're trying to avoid this tax, they're not going to be worrying about the environmental effects of this development. Therefore, we simply cannot buy this. Okay, we had some content from Ollie about how like when we talk about social services, that everyone uses it. He gave this example of Luxon and how, like, even the Nationalist Party, cares about, like, social services and getting people health care. We think that at the end of the day, when most of their voter base is in, like, farmers, is in, like, generally wealthier people, we think that, like, these incentives are definitely not as strong. We think that, therefore, their points about how we're, like, going to redistribute this money don't stand. And so we think that at the end of this day, we simply cannot buy their model as feasible. We simply cannot buy what they tell us about, like, the benefits that they're going to get for vulnerable people. And we think that, actually, they're going to make everything worse.
I like the speaker for that speech. Now moves to the reply section of the debate. So these speeches are 4 minutes long. Otherwise, the result of that will be the debate.
It's the Nationals Party favourite question to ask is always, where is the money coming from, right? So I think I find myself asking the same question in this debate, because in every turn in which we have described how a problem emerges from this tax in this debate, the AF side have simply come back at us and just said, we'll have subsidies, we'll just pay it away. But again, where on earth is the money come from? And I'll expand on that a bit more later. But I find there are 2 ways in which we can possibly win this debate. One, in which we prove to you the terrible effects that this is actually going to have on wealth inequality and on vulnerable people. And then secondly, how we prove the society-wide benefits of having more development for all. So there are 2 points of class I have in this debate which fit into this. First of all, what are the effects on wealth inequality? And second of all, what are the effects, again, on this development? So first of all, we hear a lot of push from the AF side of the House early on in their case about how we're going to use the money gained from this tax in social services. We're going to use it for hospitals, we're going to use it for schools. Now, and I like to note that, again, we're using a lot of money from this tax to use it. But also, we get this idea, like, political incentive, we just don't believe this is going to hold up, as we told you down our case. We come back and we give you this idea that, no, actually, this is going to make it far worse because the money is going to be passed on to consumers. We don't really believe we get a lot of sufficient responses to why this isn't the case, only some mitigation in the fact that we're going to use subsidies to offset the cost of the tax. Again, we find that this isn't working, right? Because if you're using the tax money to offset that of the subsidy, not only is that inefficient, but also you cannot use that then to claim benefits in investing into social services. We just don't believe this works mathematically, although I'm not a maths guy. So again, from this idea, we just don't think it works unless you're bringing in money from elsewhere and, like, running a deficit. But we can't get into that right now. So we also get this idea that, like, now we're going to have monopolies created, and we give you this idea as well. The idea that we're going to now have price increases because of this, because we're going to have more monopolies because farmers are going to sell. We get, again, the solution from the AF side of the House that, no, we are going to, like, keep them afloat with subsidies. We're going to keep our farmers afloat with subsidies. Again, I ask, where's the money coming from for this, which we just don't think we get. But again, even if you are doing this, there's just the bureaucracy. If you take them at their best, they are just, like, getting this money. With, like, the bureaucracy that we get from this, we just don't believe is fair. And we, like, also believe that we don't want these industries tied to government, always dependent, always scared about the day that a new government's going to come in and just take away all that government funding and cut things down, just like the national government has done in this election, right? So what are the effects? So that's one way in which we win this debate, right? Because we don't believe they prove to us how, like, the effects on social services are actually going to be, like, be able to coexist with also, like, mitigating any of the impacts that we have from money being passed on to consumers. So that is one way in which we win this debate, because ultimately we believe that in the end there are going to just be, like, negative harms that come from this, right? So secondly, what do we believe, like, what are the effects on the development for all? We give you a big push about how, like, generally just when you have this money, you have less money to spend on development. Additionally, we believe that like the vulnerable people are going to be spending money on spending the money developing, buying land, buying houses in worse off land. We get this idea, this pushback that actually no, we still believe that rich people are going to be able to like ride out this tax, are still going to be able to buy money from the F side of the house. We don't believe this is true. Again, as we told you down our case, first of all, because we believe that it's a massive risk for rich people to do this, which we don't believe we're going to do. As Lydia told you, again, I also go to Scots. I can second the amendment, the idea that rich people are super stingy with their money, right? We just don't believe they have the incentive to do this. And additionally, we think this misses out on this idea that ultimately the worst people are going to be on vulnerable land. We believe that's a unique harm we get on our side of the house, in which we prove in one way in which they get worse outcomes for vulnerable people, and the second one in which they also get less development for all. That is why I'm proud to negate.
Cool. I like thanking the speaker for that speech, and now to the debate, we run back to leader for East Wellington.
I think even if the negating team can prove that we get like the significant harm on some renters who the landlords just like are really bad actors and just want to exploit their people, the benefit that we get, even if only marginal, of having more revenue to invest in social services is far more widely applicable to society and has a far greater proportionate impact on those people in need. That's where we win. So on AF, we provide a progressive system aiming to uplift the lower class. We tell you that this doesn't actually harm these people themselves because these people, firstly, are not buying huge properties on either side of the house, and that secondly, it's not a significant cost because A, the properties they own are probably small, B, the properties are probably largely invaluable if they really are as poor as the impact neg characterizes, and C, like just all of my material on like landlord exploitation and why it's not going to be passed down. But like, so it's not because like the cost of this land value tax is low, but we think that the cost doesn't have to be that high anyways because the tax is like proportionate, i.e. like 0.001% of like land value is highly significant to those who own like 500 hectares of land, but to the average person who owns 200 square meters, that's like $50 a year added on. I think that that's not a significant enough cost for them to claim any of their harms to like the lower class. And like in terms of the stuff around like the money not coming back to you quick enough, I think that reasonably people can go a couple of weeks without $50 if it does mean that in the long term they get a higher quality healthcare and education. It's more likely that their family thrives more, and it's more likely they get tax relief to like put more food on the table. So yeah, I think that they haven't really like engaged with our model there, and like a lot of their cases contingent on us like actively persecuting the poor, which I just don't see any reasonable incentives for doing so. So then on the economy, firstly this point around development, which came out quite late, but I think Pearl did respond to it quite well, that firstly, the incentive is for these people to do these developments quicker in order for them to start making profits. If there is a significant cost, why would they not just want to get it done so they can make more money? But secondly, I don't think this engages with our efficiency material from Jacob. So then onto the idea of like market failure gave you and how we can fix that on our side of the house. We give you a lot of material at Jacob about how, like, especially in industries with like high greenhouse gas emissions or other like social negative externalities, right? There's like a huge capacity for the government to use this revenue to like either subsidize industries where the benefit outweighs the cost, or to just like incentivize other companies to be more accountable and to like reduce their emissions when the cost does outweigh the benefit. I think that once again that wasn't really like engaged with enough. So then on people in need, firstly I'm going to acknowledge this point around landlord explanation. Firstly, I don't think that like my whole substantive point was really engaged with enough, to the extent that the only response we heard after that was that they use tax as an excuse and just like increase the amount of rent they hold anyways, which I think can simply be like rebutted by the fact that like there are regulations on how much you can charge and there's a regulation how much you can increase it. But secondly, like this doesn't engage with my material on the flip I gave you at second about how we prevent landlords from getting like income inequality in the first place when they can't expand the amount of properties they own and they can't like increase it that way. And thirdly, it's just not as big of an impact as like the stuff we get with like social services, because that does affect the entire country and I think it affects the people in need more directly as opposed to rent. So then on like people in need, I think once again, the only response we really hear here is that it's not feasible or that the government doesn't care. Note like all of the material we gave you down the line about why the government's incentive is to care in order to like get votes, and just because they're like reasonable people, like I'm sure some of them have come from like pretty harsh living circumstances themselves. They're also going through a cost of living crisis. They probably want like the cost of their kids' education to be like higher quality and like cheaper. I think that's really reasonable. So even if we do only get a marginal benefit to those people in need, the impact is significant and should be weighed the most highly. Very proud to affirm.